Welcome to Proclaiming Justice, a podcast from PJTN that focuses the light of truth on vital issues in today's headlines that impact every American. I'm your host, Laurie Cardoza Moore, founder and president of Proclaiming Justice to the Nations, and I'm here to educate, motivate, and activate you to action. I want to arm you with the truth and the facts you'll need to fight and preserve our constitutional republic and uphold the Judeo-Christian values our nation was founded upon. Welcome to Proclaiming Justice, a PJTN podcast where we shine the light of biblical truth on vital issues from today's headlines that impact every American, Jew and Christian, people of faith, and people of conscience. I'm your host, Laurie Cardoza Moore. On this week's podcast, we're going to continue our conversation about critical race theory and its impact on our judicial system. Joining me today is PJTN's legal counsel, Michael Goldstein, to help inform our audience about this threat to our children and our republic. If you missed the last episode of this podcast, you will find it and our previous podcast lineup on our website at pjtn.org, as well as all the other platforms that you use to access your favorite podcasts. I also want to remind you that it's important for you to listen and share this and all of our previous podcasts with your family and friends so that they can become more informed about this and other related issues that threaten our republic. Mike, welcome. And before we get started, I'd like for you to briefly share with our audience your background and your experience.
Sure, Laurie. I'm a practicing attorney in Ohio, and I'm now living in Arizona, and I am the general counsel for Proclaiming Justice to the Nations, as well as state director in Arizona and in Ohio. I have my own law firm in Ohio, and I've been practicing there for many decades. I served on active duty in the Navy as a linguist. I had nuclear submarine duty, and then for 4 years. And then I followed this with 26 years in the active Naval Reserve, serving as executive officer and commanding officer of several naval security group units. And I retired from the Navy as lieutenant commander after a 30-year career as a cryptology officer. I was later president of the Northern Ohio chapter of the Association of Former Intelligence Officers. And I've actively supported by my testimony before committees of the Ohio, Tennessee, and now the Arizona General Assemblies and state boards of education, pro-Israel, pro-energy, pro-education, anti-Common Core, that is to say, and constitutional legislation in Ohio and Tennessee, and now also in Arizona. And I educate state legislators and parent groups on content for legislation to remove critical race theory and anti-Semitism indoctrination of the children in our schools.
Yes, and ladies and gentlemen, I have to tell you that Mike has been a incredible resource and supporter of the work that we've been doing in states like Tennessee and, of course, Ohio, but also in Florida. And now we're going to get to have him in Arizona. So it's critically important that we have a legal team connected with PJTN because so much of what we do is based on legislation and law. And that's one of the reasons why I have invited him on this program today, because he's one of the brightest and most compelling attorneys that I know personally. He has dedicated his life making great personal sacrifices to be able to defend our republic, to defend our Jewish brethren, to defend even Christians. And of course, now the biggest focus that we've been targeting as an organization, as PJTN, is the critical race theory and how it has infiltrated our all different levels of government. And now, of course, we knew that it was going on the college campuses, but now there is an effort to target our judicial system and our law schools. So let's start this conversation, Mike, about critical race theory and the impact it is having on the judicial system, especially as it pertains to our law schools. But before we do that, could you explain to our audience, if there's maybe a new person who's signing on today and is just not quite sure what critical race theory is. They hear CRT, they watch the news, they see the comments, parents are opposed to it, they're showing up at school board meetings. What is critical race theory, Mike?
Well, critical race theory evolved out of critical theory, which began in Germany shortly after the First World War with philosophers at a university in Frankfurt. And they were communists, socialist communists, and they were trying to foment a communist revolution in an industrial country, which was Germany. And they thought they could do that. And they did a lot of philosophizing, they did a lot of writing. And when you look at their writings, you see that every writing having to do with critical theory is completely antithetical to all the rights that we have in our Constitution. So when they finally came to the United States, which they did, they were completely at loggerheads with the United States Constitution. What happened was that the Nazis in Germany in the 1920s were in a street war with the communists in Germany at the time. They were beating each other up in the beer halls and in the streets. And finally, as we know, the Nazis came out on top, and all of these communists had to get out, especially the people who were the philosophers, and they did. And they moved bag and baggage to Columbia University Teachers College in New York City, where since that time, in the 1930s, they have been indoctrinating our teachers' colleges throughout the country with this ideology. And in the 1970s, critical theory was adopted by the law schools, by professors and students, something called critical legal theory. And the concept there is that baked into a free market economy like we have in the United States was an automatic intolerance and favored capital over labor, favored businesses over labor. And basically, they were trying to foment a class revolution in Western Europe and the United States. They couldn't get it done because it turns out that Americans were happy with their jobs. They were happy with their living conditions. They were happy with their religion. And it couldn't get done. And you see this in the writings that the critical legal theory people realized that they couldn't create a class revolution here. So they decided they needed different victimhood. So they chose race. And that's where it morphed into critical race theory. They pitted blacks against whites. And in their writings, one of the most interesting parts is they said, well, this may not be enough. We think we will need additional victim groups, which we can create, and they have. Look at the hierarchy of victimhood and intersectionality, you see that they've created plenty of victim groups, a whole hierarchy of victims. And this is now critical race theory, and it's being taught in our schools as inclusive, diverse, and equity, not equality, but equity, equality of outcome, not equality of opportunity. And when you read the major focus of their writings now, and embodied in the 1619 Project, with many of our listeners will be familiar, it doesn't give true history, it just gives stories. True history doesn't matter because they need to destroy the free market economy of the United States, tear it all down, and replace it with a socialist or communist government and ideology. So that's where we are today. And I have to say that it is now baked into our education systems, and K through 12 in particularly, but also started in higher education. And what we find is they have moved to social and emotional learning, which I'll probably talk about a little later, but it is the vehicle to bring critical race theory to our children. So that's what that is.
Well, the Marxists are truly, literally trying to overwhelm the system. Not only are we combating the curriculum in our classrooms, but the enemies of our republic are now indoctrinating our higher ed law schools, which is why I have you on the show today. It's literally, Mike, a Marxist takeover from within, is it not?
It is, and my analogy has always been that we've been working on these things for years, and there are so many problems, and I won't even begin to catalog them. But there are, a couple of dozen major problems, and I feel like the little Dutch boy who put his finger in the hole in the dike to keep the North Sea from flooding his land. And every year there are more holes in the dike, and the good people are on one side of the dike with their fingers blocking up the holes, and on the other side are all of our institutions in America, including the government, media, Hollywood, whatever, and they're drilling more holes with power tools on the other side. And the people who don't have power and don't have a lot of money are running out of fingers very quickly.
Right.
So
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's overwhelming at times. You read the article by Aaron Sabarium, who wrote the groundbreaking piece on how the legal system in America is at risk of becoming a totalitarian nightmare. The law schools have literally trained our future legal leaders in an adversarial legal system. And of course, it's to ensure both sides of a dispute were represented. But now, with the politicization and tribalism on campus, the expectation of justice in neutrality is being threatened, is it not?
Well, yes, it is. And we've been blindsided by it. This is, and I refer everybody to it. It's in Common Sense magazine in March of 2021, I believe. Just says March 21. I don't think that means March 21st. It might be, but it might be last year. Anyway, the author, as Laurie said, is Aaron Sabarium, Sibarium, in Common Sense magazine, The Takeover of America's Legal System. And I, for one, until I read this article, which really outlines what the problem is and how far it has gone, I had no idea that this was happening, because as a practicing attorney working in the field, I don't get into the law schools much, and most practicing attorneys don't. But it turns out that the students in the law schools now are just as woke as their undergraduate compatriots. And not only have they taken over the law schools, what has happened is that the attorneys in the large firms are falling in line with this.
Right.
The problem is that this is against the rule of law. These students don't believe in the rule of law anymore. They don't believe that somebody they see as evil, who would be most people to their right politically, that these people are evil, and evil people are not entitled to due process of law. They're not entitled to attorney. And
it's frightening.
This is the collapse of the American legal system. There are, as we all know, there are many woke corporations in this country, especially bigger ones, and the major law firms are sort of falling in line with this because they're afraid of losing their big clients who will go someplace else if the law firms are not hiring woke attorneys. And an example that he gives in this article is that during a conference, there were a lot of law students there, and a member of the firm, a big Democrat, a liberal guy, was speaking. But he was with a big law firm. At the end of it, there was a question from the students and the law students in the audience. We don't believe in what you're doing, representing these bad people. So we want you to give us money to do a job search so we can go to a different law firm and do our way buddy. I mean, they feel entitled. So it's that bad. And my point is this. it's very difficult to attack. And either near the end of this talk or our next one, I can talk about what some of those attacks can be, what we can do about it. But we have to realize that the problem starts in kindergarten. The people in law school have come out of undergraduate school, and if they weren't woke when they got there, they became woke in undergraduate school, and now they're in law school, and they're all woke, and they believe this stuff. It's not. I don't think it's necessarily even just an ideology; it's a theology with them. So until we do, and this is where it fits in with PJTN's missions. Woke ideology is inherently anti-Semitic in nature. There's plenty of it's replete with anti-Semitism, and as PJTN is educating Christians on their biblical duty to support Israel and the Jewish people, fighting this fits in with that mission. But our other mission of taking back America's children, that is at the heart of what is going on here, and we need to start in kindergarten. There's a big fight on now in the courts because of the statutes that have been passed in various states, very weak statutes for the most part, banning CRT being taught in the schools. There are now constitutional challenges from these woke people on the basis of alleged free speech encroachments by the right. So it's a big fight, and I do have some potential methods, paths to talk about. So there's the problem. Kindergarten through 12 and higher education, and then the law school.
Absolutely. So we've created, ladies and gentlemen, a culture where race, gender, and identity are more important than due process, as you heard Mike say, the presumption of innocence and the rule of law. Unbeknownst to many, critical race theory has been around since the 1980s. What began as a critique of neutral principles of justice became mainstream in America's law schools. And yes, we are we've got the building blocks of education, K through 12, as Mike said. And that's why PJTN is out front fighting this battle on the front lines every day to expose what's going on. We saw Governor DeSantis, thank God, who threw out 41% of the textbooks that publishers had submitted for the math curriculum to be used in Florida schools this year because there were examples of critical race theory in the math textbooks and Common Core, which Governor DeSantis did away with. But let's get back to, what's happening in these law schools, Mike, because I was shocked at some of the universities that are falling prey to this, like Georgetown Law School. They're going to require all students to take a class on the importance of questioning the law's neutrality and assessing its differential effects on subordinated groups. Mike, help me understand this, break this down. I mean, if the Constitution is the foundation and our laws are introduced and passed and must be constitutional, although you and I both know there's plenty of laws on the books that are unconstitutional, but that's for a different topic. But let's talk about, these law schools and what they are requiring now, making this part of the prerequisite for graduation. Even the Cardoza School of Law, my namesake, the Yeshiva University's Cardoza School of Law, has also implemented similar requirements. And of course, we expect it from UC Irvine School of Law. That's a no-brainer. University of Southern California Gould School of Law, and of course, Boston College Law School are among others. This is a dangerous trend.
What has happened here is law schools have asked the American Bar Association to pass resolutions requiring law schools to teach CRT and to teach wokeness. And if they don't, the regulations would say, if you don't teach this, then your students will not have a good legal education and probably, can't get jobs. Okay. So
Mm-hmm.
it was initiated by the law schools, but the American Bar Association has put on in 2021, they started a critical race theory webinar series. There were 4 series: the insurgent origins of critical race theory, looking backwards to move forward, race reform and retrenchment revisited, can states ban learning about our full history? They're saying that if you're banning critical race theory in the schools, the teachers can't teach our true history, all of it.
Mm-hmm.
You look at
Mm-hmm.
something like, and I'll recommend this to everybody, Robert Woodson in his 1776 Unites project. That's not to be confused with President Trump's 1776 commission, which is a different story that we can talk about another time. Robert Woodson is a Black gentleman who put together a group of Black scholars to teach real American history to Black and Hispanic students starting in New York, where they teach real American history, the bad and the good. They teach what the founding fathers were trying to do, what we did do.
Mm-hmm.
They teach about slavery. They teach about Jim Crow. They teach all of it. So banning critical race theory from our schools does not mean the teachers can't teach true history. They can.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And it's acknowledged by most legal scholars, historians, academic historians, that, for
Mm-hmm.
instance, the 1619 curriculum from the Pulitzer Foundation, based on the New York Times Magazine article, is not real history, but it's being
Right.
taught as history, even
Mm-hmm.
though the editor of the 1619 article in the New York Times Magazine admits that it's not real history, and they never intended it to be taught as history.
Yep.
That's baloney. Of course, they intended it to be taught as history, and it is. So the support of Robert Woodson's 1776 Unites project is a very good thing, and we should all be supporting it. And you can go online and find it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's, you mentioned the American Bar Association, and really it's shocking that such a time-honored association that's always been respected as a pillar in the judicial world is now requiring all these accredited law schools to provide this education to law students on bias, cross-cultural competency, and racism. And the American Bar Association recently voted 348 to 17 to adopt these new standards.
You took the words right out of my mouth. I was about to mention that. So the American Bar Association has been on the left for the past 30 or 40 years. It should be
Mm-hmm.
recognized. They don't represent a lot of the attorneys in this country in terms of ideology. In fact, they have an ideology, and they should not have an ideology. They should be completely neutral, and they should be talking about the law and educating law students in the law, and
Right.
not. But that is the mountain that we have to climb.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Mike, we are coming up on a break. We're going to close this show, and I want to have you come back next week. There's still some more items we need to cover, and then God willing, we're going to have time to cover what you recommend that we do. What can we do as an organization, as PJTN, and also grassroots Americans? What can they do? I mean, if our judicial system collapses under this, where's justice? It's very frustrating. But ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for joining us on this program, for listening to Mike Goldstein. Mike has been, as I said, a tremendous asset. I want to encourage all of you to go to our website to learn more about how to take back local control of your children's education, because, ladies and gentlemen, it ultimately starts with you, as Mike so eloquently stated, that, these seeds are planted in K through 12. And these kids grow up, they go to, university, and, it's just they're being inundated and hard-pressed on every side. And our children, this generation growing up, is going to think this is normal. If you are interested in hosting a summit, as Mike talked about, PJTN is on the front lines of this issue, trying to combat the disinformation, trying to take back America's children. And we are doing summits. We're hosting summits across the United States this year. This is an election year. It's critically important that we know who we're voting for, especially our school board members and our county commissioners, who typically hold the purse strings to what curriculum is coming in. But if you're interested in hosting a summit to help motivate and activate your county to flip your school board, now is the time to do it. We want to hear from you. This is, as I said, an election year, and it is time for us to act. I hope you enjoyed this program. We will post this podcast on our website and all of our podcast platforms so that you can share with your family and friends. As PJTN Watchmen, we have a biblical mandate to stand against the ungodly rising Marxist threat that is destroying this nation and threatening our Judeo-Christian values. We cannot remain silent. God warned the prophet Ezekiel about the responsibility of the watchman, that when the watchman sees the enemy advancing, it is the duty of the watchman to warn the inhabitants of the city so that no innocent blood is shed, so that people are prepared. But if the watchman doesn't warn the inhabitants and any innocent blood is shed, it will be required of that watchman. God will require it of them because they didn't sound the alarm. And as a watchman, you can sound the alarm and warn others by simply sharing this podcast with your family and friends. Please share and like this podcast to help sound the alarm in your county. Dietrich Bonhoeffer reminded us, silence in the face of evil is itself evil. God will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak is to speak, and not to act is to act. So in closing, don't forget to join us for next week's podcast as we bring Mike back to continue this conversation about combating the rise of anti-Semitism and taking back local control of our communities and our children's education. I want to also remind you that if you have not signed up to become a PJTN Watchman, you can help support this effort and more programs like this for just $20 a month. With your generous monthly donation, you can ensure that PJTN remains on the front lines and in the headlines, but we can't do it without your faithful prayers and financial support. I hope that you will prayerfully consider supporting our mission as we educate to activate Jews, Christians, and all people of conscience to stand on the front lines of this all-encompassing war. I want to leave you with the sobering statement by Abraham Lincoln when he said, "The philosophy of the classroom in one generation will be the philosophy of the government in the next." God bless you, and thank you for all you do on behalf of our Jewish brethren, the State of Israel, and these United States. Thank you again for joining me on this edition of Proclaiming Justice. Please share this podcast with your family and friends. For more information about how you can get involved, please visit our website at pjtn.org. As a PJTN Watchman, you can help us keep up the fight to preserve our freedom for our children and their children for such a time as this.